Hello everyone, welcome to this second webinar in the cycle of our bioethics webinars. We are here with the students from Cal State University Bay. Today we have a great guest from the University of Lancaster, Alison Stone. She's going to talk about being born, which is a very fascinating topic. And yeah, feel free to ask questions. The presentation is going to be around 20 minutes and then a debate will follow. The floor is all yours. Thank you, Alison.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's hope it works. And view, no, slideshow, play from start. There we go. Can everyone see it? Yep, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about being born. And this is partly a summary of some things I've said in a book that I recently wrote about being born. Now, obviously, we all die and we're all born. So far, it may change, but that's been the case up till now. But philosophers generally have only talked about one of what we could think of as our two ends, the end when we die and then the end, as it were, before we came into being in the first place. And philosophers have generally focused a lot more on death. Now, bioethics is maybe one of the areas of philosophy where that's less true, and that might be something we want to talk about. But even there, I would say there's been more attention in some ways to death, so that philosophers have asked things like whether death is bad. I mean, it, on the face of it seems bad, but maybe immortality would actually be worse because we would end up bored and all projects would become meaningless to us. So maybe death isn't that bad after all. What are better and worse ways to die? How is the whole nature of our existence shaped by the fact that we're going to die, or our awareness that we're going to die? So these are just some of the sorts of questions that philosophers have talked about. Now, a bit of an exception to this tendency to focus on death rather than birth is some recent work in feminist philosophy, but even there, the attention has tended to be more on those who are giving birth rather than what it means to be born and how one's life is shaped by the fact that one's been born. And I would say that for the most part, this also goes for bioethics, so that there would be a lot more focus on those who are reproducing and contributing to reproduction in different ways, rather than on what it is to have been born. So what I've tried to think about is how being born does shape our existence. And so I call this our condition insofar as we're born, natality. I'm not the only one to do that. Other people use the word that way as well. So we're natals as well as mortals, and our condition is one of natality as well as mortality. So first question to think about is what it is to be born. What does being born consist in? And my suggestion is that we can understand it in terms of three aspects. So to be born is to begin to exist at a certain point in time, and to do so by coming into the world with a particular body or as a particular body, and coming into a certain place in the world, a particular set of relationships, and some coming somewhere in time and somewhere in history. And then also to begin to exist and to come into the world by way of being conceived and then gestated in someone's womb and then coming out of the womb. And of course, we might often say coming out of a mother's womb, but there are increasing numbers of trans pregnancies. So it's a difficult one because we sort of want to acknowledge that historically it's pretty much always been a mother's womb that you come out of, but at the same time you don't want to be too stipulative that it could only ever be a maternal womb, because there are trans fathers now. Anyway, so on that last point as well about birth as being conceived and gestated in and then coming out of someone's womb, we can distinguish between narrower and broader ways of talking about this. So sometimes when people say being born, they mean just coming out of the womb and not being gestated or conceived, but just the exit from the womb, that you're born when you leave the parent's womb. Now, I myself prefer a broader view where what it is to be born is to be, as I've just said, to be conceived and gestated and then exit the womb. But then there are also those who would see birth more broadly again and talk in terms of psychological birth going on right through an infant's first years, so that all of that physical process of gestation and then leaving the womb is just part of it, and it's a broader psychological process as well. So I've kind of gone for the middle view on that. So what we're doing in thinking about how we exist as beings who are born, or how we're natals, is looking at how those three aspects of what it is to be born give rise to various features of our existence and how they affect various features of our existence, so that the whole way that we live and the whole way that we exist is the way it is only because we're born. So what I now want to do for the rest of this is to begin to talk about some of the actual features that I think our existence has insofar as we're born. And I'm just going to have to kind of run through them very briefly. And it's only a few of what I think are all of the features that could be identified. So it's just a sort of a partial list. So the first thing to say something about here is dependency. So it's obvious, but when human babies are born and while they're still infants, they are acutely helpless. They really can do hardly anything, as any of you who may have either had babies or looked after babies will know. At first, a baby really can't do anything at all. You know, it's an achievement when a baby first manages to roll over. So that means that babies, infants need a lot of care. And this continues, of course, for a long time, even once they've got some of the physical abilities and they can go to the toilet for themselves and they can eat and so on. They still need a lot of education and education into the culture that we're part of. So all of this means that we begin life utterly dependent on those who are giving us care. And we're also emotionally dependent on them as well. Now, all of this follows from birth, because the nature of what it is to be gestated and then come out of someone's womb means that when we first come into existence, we're very undeveloped. there's only so much development that can go on without the baby's brain getting too big so that it could no longer safely come out of the womb and pass out of the birth canal. So we have to be born to leave the womb when we're still really very undeveloped and immature, and hence we're so dependent. And we're much more dependent than the nearest primates to us in species terms. When their babies are born, they're much more, they have a lot more abilities comparatively than human babies. Now, usually we become more independent, obviously, over the course of life as we get older, but it's never complete. And of course, it's somewhat impermanent because we can become really dependent again if we get seriously ill or in old age, or if we have certain disabilities. But even in the case of what we might think of as the most sort of independent, kind of fully autonomous human being, they actually still are dependent on others around them in very many ways. There's few of us who could really manage to get our own means of subsistence if we, were suddenly kind of out in the wilderness and having to fend for ourselves. We also depend on others in terms of language. Language isn't really something that any single person can have. It depends upon everyone speaking the language. And we depend on others for our emotional well-being. And then there are basic relationships of social trust all the time, that if I go out of my house and walk along the street, I'm trusting that the other people are not, going to suddenly kind of spring out of their houses and mug me, trying to steal my money. So we have this level of trust of one another, and we depend on one another in that sort of tacit way all the time. And all these kinds of dependency, obviously these are not so closely related to birth, but they still have connections with the dependency that we first have as infants. So of course, babies at first can't speak, but they learn to speak, and they learn to speak the language that's around them, and they depend on the others around them for that. And they're emotionally dependent as we continue to be into adulthood. Okay, so that was just something about dependency. The next thing I want to say something about very briefly, just going to have a look at the time, is about the relationality of the self. And so I'm guided here by psychoanalytic thought, the tradition of psychoanalysis, and the emphasis that it puts on what a formative impact our first caregivers and our first relationships with those caregivers have on us. And these relationships, I would say, are so formative for us, partly just because they're the first ones that we ever experience. And what comes first always tends to have a big impact, like one's first ever boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever it may be. The first thing always sort of is particularly powerful as coming first. And then these early relationships with caregivers are also so formative because, again, when we start life, we're so dependent. We depend on these people for satisfying all of our needs. We couldn't manage at all without them. And then we're so unformed at this point. So when the baby first comes into being, their whole personality is yet to develop. I mean, there are genetic elements within them that are going to influence their personality, but at the same time, that personality isn't yet formed. So, and all of the cognitive abilities that we develop haven't yet come in. So all of this remains to come. And as it's coming in, it becomes influenced by the relationships we have at the time with our caregivers. Now, according to various writers in the psychoanalytic tradition, they've kind of identified at least 2 levels at which we ourselves are shaped by those first relationships with caregivers. So on the one hand, there's what's talked about as our core self, your most basic sense of yourself as an individual at all, who's got their own experience, who has their own sense of agency. And the thought is that even that is really shaped by our first interactions with others. And then there's also, secondly, our more concrete personality, if you like, so the particular emotional traits that we each have and dispositions and the ways that we tend to react towards other people. So in a way, it's easier to see how that would be quite heavily shaped by the first relationships. But the more controversial claim is probably that even our most core sense of self depends upon the early relationships. If both of these things are true, that we're shaped in terms of our core self as well as these sort of detailed personality features, then it means that the earliest relationships that we have, they constitute who we are. So it's not that I'm first this person, Alison Stone, and then these other things sort of come along accidentally. It's that they've constituted who I am in the first place. But that was relationality of the self. So the next thing that I want to talk about, oh, and perhaps I should, before moving on though, just say that I think I've already kind of indicated how this relationality of the self is connected with being born, because we're born and therefore we're dependent on our first caregivers and they come first in our lives. And when we're born, we're very unformed, so there's a lot of scope to be formed by the people around us. So that's how it connects together with birth. So the next thing I want to say something about is situatedness. So this is also a concept that is often talked about within the traditions of existentialism and phenomenology within philosophy and related disciplines. But the thought here that I want to put forward is just that in being born, you come into a situation somewhere in history and in society, and you come into a particular ethnic group or somewhere in geographical terms, and you come into a certain family in a certain place in the generations of that family, all of these things. And so for each individual, it's going to be a unique set of factors that make up their situation. So I think we can say that there's something like a natal situation, which is the first set of circumstances and relationships that you come into when you're born. And then this in turn affects every subsequent situation that you come to be in. And so in that way, all of a person's situations flow down through their life from one's birth. Now, I was thinking here that this may be somewhat debated, because we could all agree that we begin life in a certain situation. But then some may think that once you've come into that situation, and at least once you've grown into older childhood, say, that you're then free to choose what you want to do. So the situation's just sort of there as the background, but basically you're then free to take what particular path you like, so that you kind of can leave your situation behind. And so the picture that I personally prefer is more to think that you are initially in a certain situation, and that affects how you respond as well as what you have to respond to. And through that, you then come to be in another situation, which is what you have to respond to, but also all of what you've already gone through shapes how you respond to it, and so on and so on, so that you never can kind of just entirely leave that first situation behind. Everything else does come out of it. However far you also move away from it, it's still only from that first situation that you've made this journey. Okay, the final thing today that I want to say something about is one factor that we are situated in terms of when we're born, i.e. social power relations. And so these obviously include relationships of gender and race, economic relations, to mention just a few. And these begin straight away to be transmitted to us through the first relationships that we come into by birth, and through the situations that we come into in terms of what family we're in and where that family is living within the world, and what community we're born in and how that community is located economically, for instance. So that these power relations begin to affect us straight away, long before we have any possibility of questioning them, or long before we've formed any capacity for questioning these power relationships or criticizing them. Now, that's not to say that we never can come to criticize them or question them. Obviously, people often do, but when they do start to, they learn how to do that from within a place in power relationships that they have come into. And so what I want to suggest here is that, as others have said too, Judith Butler, for instance, in a different way, and Foucault as well, that power is normal and constitutive, a normal feature of human life, rather than something that merely happens to us sort of accidentally, that it's always there. But what I also want to suggest is that this is so partly because we're born, so it's another thing that relates to our natality, because we're born into power relationships from the very beginning, and because we're born helpless and dependent, so that power begins to affect us before there's anything we can do about it. So that was just 4 features of our existence where it's affected by being born. And I would say where these things are the way they are for us, we're dependent on one another in the ways we are, and ourselves are relational, and we're situated as we are and involved in power as we are, only that way because we're born. So supposing hypothetically that we weren't born, that we entered existence or came to existence in some other way, these features wouldn't manifest themselves, I don't think, in the same way that they do at the moment. Now, they're not the only ways that being born shapes our existence, but hopefully it's begun to give you a sense of how pervasively being born does shape our existence. So, yep, that was very short, but hopefully there are things that you want to respond to about it.
Thank you so much. A virtual applause for you. I'm
Oh,
Unfortunately, we can't be
yeah.
close to
Maybe
each
I
other.
should, shall I stop? I'll stop sharing my screen.
Ah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Generally, speakers forget this step, so we can see
Okay.
each other
Yeah.
is much better. Thank
Okay.
you so much for the excellent presentation. These are essential points we need to keep in mind because, yeah,
Okay.
this is essential part of our life. Now, I open the floor to questions. Anything you want to ask to our excellent interlocutor today? And yeah, you can either type it in the private chat box and there will be your speaker, or you can just take the floor and ask the question. All right. So I will do the icebreaker for the time being. So my question, it's not something connected to what you explicitly said, so maybe I'll force it a little bit,
No problem.
just in case you already developed this somewhere else. What would you say is the relationship between natality and miscarriage? I mean, this moment of being conceived, not being born, yet being in some kind of relationship with existence. Have you developed this direction of research?
Yeah.
Yeah, for
So
what it means, yeah, for
with the
the
sound cut out for a moment, so I need to ask you, so was it about miscarriage?
right.
Was it, yeah. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to check because the sound had disappeared for a moment.
Sorry, yeah.
Oh, that's all right. Gosh. I mean, one thing I suppose is that I think that does bring out something of why I think it's important to take being born as a process that does begin when we're conceived, rather than sort of taking the starting point to be when someone exits their parents' womb, because not everyone makes it. I mean, I think about a quarter of pregnancies end with a miscarriage. So, and I mean, I guess as you probably know, it's something that hasn't, I mean, just as it hasn't been talked about that much in the wider culture, it has not been talked about a great deal within philosophy. I mean, that seems to be starting to change. And I suppose, so some of the things that I've been talking about to do with relationality and sort of first relationships, I mean, that already begins, I think, from as soon as conception has happened. But I guess one of the reasons I think, I mean, this is probably particularly true for all of you in the US. My sense is that people have been a bit nervous of talking about miscarriage and sort of acknowledging the depth of the bond that you can feel with the embryo from a really early point, because then it begins to look as if maybe people should never be legally permitted to have abortions. My sense is that that's been a worry, sort of how to reconcile wanting it to be legally permissible for people to have abortions, at least after a certain point, and acknowledging how difficult miscarriage is. Does that seem, do you think that's right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's why I asked the question, because we don't talk about that. Yes, it's changing. but not that much. And the most common question women receive is from gynecologists often is try fast to have another one. And literature is showing that plenty of children who were born after a miscarriage interiorized the depression of the mother, who is still crying the miscarriage. So this brings in itself the relationality, the situatedness you were talking about. It's not something that get lost. So you have a miscarriage, that chapter is closed. Next, no, there's a birth. I see that with you. I mean, that I don't want to take a position in relation to abortion, but I agree with you that at the conception, there's already a birth somehow. There's an existence that has to life. And this is not just for the mother. I mean, it's the family nucleus that feels that. How do we do with it? What kind of meaning should it have in our life? Yeah, certainly it's something that needs to be externalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is a really helpful question for me, actually, because this makes me aware of part of why I think it is good to not take birth to just be. It's once you have come out of the womb, because then in a way it sort of contributes to making miscarriage invisible, because it's that idea, well, until the baby's born, nothing's really happened and nobody was really there. But this thing about that a miscarriage is meant to be immediately over and done with, I must just say, on a personal note, I've actually had 2 miscarriages as well as a birth, a complete birth.
Yeah, I have a friend this morning who told me, I just got a miscarriage. That's why it was the first thing. It happens very, very often, unfortunately.
It is very common. But I also, when I, after the second of the miscarriages, I was quite unhappy. And when I saw a doctor about it, he was rather old-fashioned, but he did say, why on earth are you upset? It should only take 3 days to get over a miscarriage. I don't know where he'd got this 3 days thing from. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Alison. Oh, God. But thank you for sharing, because that's how it is. Even in the most developed country, as far as I'm reading, because I started doing research on it, and only in a very, alternative clinics, you find the integral way of treating the woman. That should be normal, but you have to go to alternative holistic centers to receive some kind of, fresh empathy, free from all these strange. 3 days. It's ridiculous. We have a question.
Okay, so I can see that, so I can see that. So Alice has said, I have a question about ectogenesis. How do you think it may affect these features? Gosh, I mean, this is a huge question. I think, so I think this is my view, though, I'm very undecided about this, because this is an area where it's all changing so rapidly, as it looks like ectogenesis is becoming more and more sort of an imminent possibility. And some think that it would really change all of these features, something that it would change the whole nature of our condition, really. And I am less sure in a strange way, despite what I've said, I'm not so sure about that. So I think that it would still obviously be the case that we would begin to exist and we would come into the world in a certain situation. I mean, the nature of our dependency would, I mean, some of the dependency that we now have on the person that's gestating us, it would shift so that we were dependent on the technology that was maintaining us until we were sort of mature enough to then be handed over to the parent. So I guess there would still be a lot of dependency on the parent. And I assume that what would happen if a baby was being gestated in an artificial womb, I assume that the parent or parents would still go along and spend a lot of time with the developing baby and probably be talking to the baby, so that, you know, some relationality, I think, would still be going on, and they would be involved in power relationships, certainly. I mean, those might be a bit different, and some would think the power relationships involved in kind of medical technologies and the power of sort of scientists and medics would have increased, but there would still be power relationships. So I am not sure that it would represent this really complete transformation of our existence. I would be happy to hear what you think. You're welcome to say in chat. I know you say poor English skills, but your English seems perfect. Yeah.
We are all on the same boat, Alice. Not my first language either.
And so then Victor has asked, what is the relationship between dependency and trust? Yeah. So I think you're quite right to raise this, because it seems that one of the things that can happen is, of course, babies and infants are very dependent, and if some of the things that they need from their caregivers aren't met, if their emotional needs particularly aren't met, then their whole capacity to trust others can be damaged. I mean, not necessarily beyond repair. It can maybe then be repaired through later relationships, but still, it also can be damaged. And then that's going to interfere with our ability to sort of maintain that everyday level of trust. So I think that's another really helpful question, actually, because that sort of brings out a way in which, when I was talking about that sort of everyday level of trust in one another that we have, how that too is something that's affected by birth and by the first relationships. I mean, one of the difficulties that comes up here, though, is that there's always a tension, at least for feminist philosophers, and I identify myself as a feminist philosopher, that there's a tension between, you want to sort of acknowledge the importance of caregiving and what an effect it has on children and how important it is for them. But then there's always the difficulty that it starts to sound like you're going to be blaming caregivers, you know, if they haven't done a good enough job. And very often, you know, that can be because they are in difficult circumstances themselves. So it's difficult. And I mean, I don't think there's any easy answer to it, really, how to sort of acknowledge the importance of what they do, which means that if things go wrong, then it can have really damaging effects on children. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want to be kind of just holding the caregivers to blame for this. So this is just a dilemma, really.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Samuel has asked how much of the dynamics associated with a given birth are innate, hereditary, or how much is socially ingrained? Well, as you know, people have been wondering about this for a long time. I think I would have to say that I just don't have an answer in terms of being able to say it's 50-50 or that it's 35-65 or anything like that. I realize that might seem a bit frustratingly indefinite. I mean, I do think there are some innate elements. So, I mean, I've noticed with my daughter that there were just certain traits that she seemed to come with. And other people I know, you know, when they had young children, say if they had 2 or 3, you know, they just found that those children did really different things. But of course, it's really hard to distinguish because there might also be social elements behind that. I mean, the thing is that they just sort of begin to form such a mixture straight away that it makes it really hard to measure what proportion they're each contributing, because from the start, whatever innate dispositions we have begin to be kind of taken up by the people around us and responded to in different ways, depending who's around them socially. And then, yeah, that can cause them to become expressed in different ways. But at the same time, as I'm sure you know, there are all these studies of kind of long lost twins, you know, who've ended up having some remarkably similar traits, despite having been separated early on and brought up in different circumstances. So, yeah. Yeah. Okay, and I'm now just looking at Alice's response. Right, about Firestone and the dialectic of sex. Absolutely. Yeah. So, right. That's an interesting thought about whether ectogenesis could extend the gestation period for more than 9 months, and then babies would be born more ready. I mean, that is a really interesting idea. Now, I think that if that did begin to happen, that really might begin to transform us quite heavily, because at the moment, I think we come into the world amongst other people when we're so unformed that creates a lot of scope for the particular people around us and the circumstances that we come into and what society we come into. It creates more scope for all of that to influence us from the beginning. Whereas if by the time we came out of the artificial womb, more of our sort of traits and capacities were already kind of set and had already begun to come in because we developed further, that might make us less open to being influenced by the people and societies around us. And there I feel like my imagination begins to fail a bit, and I sort of think, oh gosh, I just don't know what infants would then be like if they were much more kind of set when they already began to interact more with others. But I suppose, again, it might depend on what conditions were like in the artificial womb, because if the parent or parents were coming to the baby in the artificial womb and spending a lot of time with them and talking to them sort of with certain voices and maybe reading them certain things and telling them certain things, then there could still be a lot of influence at work on the baby even while they were in the artificial womb. Possibly. I mean, the thing is as well, although you know, as I said earlier, it's become a bit more imminent because there's been, as you probably know, some recent things where is it a lamb was grown, I think, for about 4 weeks in a kind of fluid filled bag, a sort of artificial womb. But I mean, all of this, it's still enough of a long way off that I guess at first, if anyone began to be born through ectogenesis, it would probably be very prohibitively expensive. And I mean, it would be a very sort of resource intensive way of bringing babies into the world as compared to more natural ways. So it is interesting, I suppose, to begin to think about what the environmental costs of doing it might be, because I think it would sort of use a lot of energy and a lot of resources to generate babies that way, at least as things are at the moment. And so, yes, so someone else has asked, at the risk of taking things into the realms of science fiction, yeah, there are terrestrial creatures that come into being without being born, sure. Yeah, if we encountered an intelligent creature from somewhere else that had not been born, how could we communicate? I mean, this is a good question, because of course there are there are birds, for instance, that hatch with eggs, hatch from eggs. I'm not sure. I guess we can have a level of communication with some birds. I always tend to be someone who, if I'm given a hypothetical situation, I will sort of try to translate it into an actual one. You will find that a lot of philosophers are the reverse. If you give them an actual thing, they'll go to a hypothetical one. I mean, we can have communication with some birds, like sort of parrots and parakeets and minor birds and so on. So I guess we can communicate to some degree. And of course, there are other creatures that are gestated from wombs that we can't really communicate with awfully well. I have 4 rabbits, and I'm kind of doubtful that they really actually understand any human words at all. But I think it is an interesting question about how it would affect communication, for sure. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so someone else asks, how would a child be affected, right, if they had a negative relationship with their first caregivers, and what would the dependency look like? I mean, I suppose that, I think there's few of us who could say that we have had a perfect relationship with our first caregivers. So I suppose we're all familiar with some of the sorts of problems that can arise. Somebody earlier had asked about trust and how, if the relationship with their first caregiver wasn't very good, how would that affect trust? But I guess many of us would suffer from some degree of insecure attachment. So I would guess that some of you know of attachment theory, and the idea that there are these three basic forms of attachment that we can have with the first caregiver, and we then tend to transfer them to other relationships. So we can be securely attached or insecurely, or we can be avoidant. And so I suppose that maybe illustrates some of the negative things that can happen. So you can end up with an insecure attachment and then kind of take that forward to subsequent relationships. Or you can then respond to the insecurity by becoming avoidant and sort of shutting down on intimacy. So, but I mean, those are just a few things. I mean, I guess you can think of negative relationships as arising along many ways, really. I mean, I like to hold out the hope that it is not necessarily beyond repair, but I suppose it is a difficulty, again, if you want to think of these first relationships as being very formative. It then can seem that you're a bit doomed to just sort of carry negative patterns forward. So I mean, I think this is just it's sort of another of these dilemmas where we kind of want to acknowledge different things that pull against one another. Okay, radical difference like budding. Yeah. So I suppose that beings that come into being, yeah, in ways that are further removed, like that. It's an interesting thought, partly because it perhaps does show that the life forms that seem further removed from us maybe tend to be ones that reproduce or come into being in ways that are further away from birth. So things like viruses as well. I hardly dare to mention them at the moment, but you know that they reproduce in a way that seems fairly far removed from ours. Somebody's asked, I would like to ask, after the difference between relationships not qualifying but constituting ourselves, yeah, and where would that make a difference? Okay, yeah, so that's a big question. So I think sometimes there's an idea that the ideal thing is really for us to be independent, and independence or autonomy, as it might be also talked about, would be seen as the kind of ideal, and so that we would be able to choose as many aspects of our life autonomously as possible, or have as little interference from others as possible. Whereas the more you think of relationships as constituting the self, the harder it becomes, I suppose, to have that as an ideal of autonomy or kind of choosing everything for oneself, because it seems more of a mirage, I suppose, like, I mean, almost a kind of illusion. So I think that's one way that it makes a difference, is perhaps that there's been so much of a focus on autonomy, and that would be true for a lot of bioethics as well, that autonomy has been a really central value. Whereas I guess dependency has not, I would say it has not really been seen as a value. It often seems to be seen more as unfortunate, that dependency is something that we really need to try to avoid or reduce. Even at a political level as well, when you have the kind of idea that it's good for people to be sort of self-reliant and not dependent upon help from others or help from the state. So that's just a sort of very general answer, but I think that the more we think of relationships as constituting the self, the harder it becomes to see autonomy as being sort of such a central value as it has been. It's not that we need to stop thinking in terms of autonomy altogether, but there are theorists who've talked about relational autonomy, and I'm fairly sympathetic to that. So this is the thought that really, if somebody, to the extent that somebody is autonomous, is able to make decisions for themselves and do things like imagine different possibilities and choose between them and carry plans out, that it depends on the relationships they've been through in their life and the relationships that they're still in, and whether they're supportive of these capacities. So that it's not that we don't want to value autonomy on this scheme at all, but it's more autonomy within relationships, so that you have to value relationships as well. Not so much autonomy against relationships, but autonomy within relationships. Yeah, sorry, I've realized I've just been talking for ages and ages here.
I love it. And I think I speak for everyone here. Yeah, thank you for sharing so much of your time. It was, yeah, it was really great. And this last thing you were saying, yeah, makes me think, I don't know, I go toward hard philosophy here, but mereology, for example, that which is that part of philosophy that really trains us to think in terms of parts and whole. So we are independent, but at the same time, in our independency, we are a whole. Like, yeah, the leg of a table, yes, okay, could be just a leg, but it's a part of a table. So trying to break that sense of individualism that is, yeah, impairing to a thriving society, but at the same time defending our right to, you know, stand up for ourselves and to not rely on others for our own decisions. It's really a fine balance there. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your scholarship, your expertise, your life, because I think that, yeah, also you as a person came across in this very short period of time. I feel very lucky that you accepted this invitation. And yeah, thank you, all the people who joined this seminar, my students, and the people across the world. We had people from Germany, Brazil. It fills my heart with joy to see that I can share knowledge in such an easy way. Good for technology sometimes,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you for organizing it, and thank you to
My pleasure.
everyone for the great questions and for listening. Yeah.
Yeah, really great questions. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll meet soon for another webinars. I don't remember when and on what, but I know that a new one is coming up soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good day.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.